The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravenshire Palace as Queen Consort Corinna walked through the silent corridors. Her silk slippers made no sound against the cold stone, but her heart hammered loudly in her chest. In her trembling hands she clutched a small velvet pouch that contained secrets worth more than most people would see in their entire lives. 3 months had passed since Queen Helena's funeral, and the palace still felt empty without the beloved monarch's presence. Helena had ruled for 47 years with wisdom and grace, earning the deep love of her people. Now her son, King Marcus, sat on the throne, and Corinna stood beside him as his queen consort. But the crown that should have brought her joy felt heavier each day. Weighed down by debts that threatened to destroy everything, Corinna paused outside the private study that had once belonged to Helena. The room remained exactly as the late queen had left it, filled with books, personal letters, and most importantly, the collection of jewelry that Helena had treasured. These weren't just any pieces of jewelry. They were historic artifacts, some dating back centuries, each one carrying the weight of royal tradition and the memories of queens who had worn them before the financial troubles had started small. Corinna's gambling habit began as innocent entertainment during long palace evenings. A few card games with visiting nobles, small bets on horse races, nothing that seemed dangerous. But gambling was like a hungry beast that grew larger with each feeding. Soon she was sneaking out to underground casinos in the city, placing larger and larger bets, always believing that the next game would be the one to solve all her problems. When King Marcus was away on diplomatic missions, Corinna would disappear for entire nights. She told herself she was just having fun, that she deserved some excitement after the boring duties of royal life. But fun turned into desperation as her losses mounted. She had already sold most of her own jewelry, telling Marcus she was having pieces reset or cleaned. She had borrowed money from several sources, creating a web of debt that grew more tangled each day. Standing in Helena's study, Corinna looked at the glass cases that held the crown jewels. The midnight sapphire necklace caught her eye first. Helena had worn it to every state dinner, and its deep blue stones seemed to hold all the mystery of the ocean. Beside it sat the diamond rose tiara, crafted for Queen Victoria III in 1887. Its intricate design featuring roses made entirely of diamonds and platinum. Corinna's hands shook as she opened the first case. The security system had been changed after Helena's death, but Marcus had given her the codes, trusting her completely. Why wouldn't he? She was his wife, his queen consort, the woman he had chosen to stand by his side and help him rule the kingdom. The weight of his trust made what she was about to do feel even more terrible, but the creditors wouldn't wait any longer. She had received another threatening letter just that morning. Viktor Kozlov, the man who ran the underground casino where she had lost most of her money, was not known for his patience. His letter was polite but clear: pay the debt within 1 week, or face consequences that would expose her secrets to the world. The amount was staggering, nearly $2 million. Even as queen consort, she didn't have access to that kind of money without Marcus knowing about it. The plan had formed slowly in her mind over several sleepless nights. She would take just a few pieces, the ones that weren't used for official ceremonies. She knew a dealer in the city who dealt with wealthy collectors who didn't ask too many questions about where precious items came from. She would sell just enough to pay off Victor and get back on solid ground. Then she would find a way to replace the pieces before anyone noticed they were missing. Corinna carefully lifted the midnight sapphire necklace from its case. The stones were cold against her skin, and for a moment she imagined Helena's disapproving spirit watching her from beyond. Helena had always been kind to Corinna, welcoming her into the family when Marcus announced their engagement. The late queen had even shared stories about each piece of jewelry, explaining their history and the responsibilities that came with caring for them. "These aren't just beautiful objects," Helena had said during one of their private conversations. "They're symbols of continuity, connecting us to the queens who came before and the ones who will come after. Each piece carries the trust of our people." Now, Corinna was breaking that trust in the worst possible way, but she told herself she had no choice. If the truth about her gambling debts came out, It would destroy Marcus's reputation and damage the monarchy itself. She was doing this to protect the crown, she convinced herself. Even as her conscience screamed that she was lying, she placed the necklace in the velvet pouch, followed by a pair of emerald earrings. That had belonged to Queen Margaret in the 1600s. Her hands moved quickly now, as if speed could somehow make the crime less serious. A diamond bracelet, a ruby brooch, a small tiara that was rarely used for public events. Each piece that went into the pouch felt like another nail in the coffin of her honor. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made Corinna freeze. She quickly closed the jewelry cases and hid the pouch in the folds of her dress. A palace maid appeared in the doorway, curtsying respectfully. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption. The king has returned early from his trip and is asking for you in the throne room." Corinna forced a smile. "Thank you, Maria. Please tell His Majesty I'll be there shortly." As the maid disappeared, Corinna felt the weight of the stolen jewelry against her body. Marcus was home early, which meant she would have to postpone her meeting with the dealer. But delay was dangerous too. Every moment the jewelry remained missing increased the chance of discovery. She left Helena's study with careful, measured steps, playing the role of the perfect queen consort while carrying the evidence of her betrayal. In just a few hours, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The woman who had entered that study was still innocent, still worthy of the crown she wore. The woman who left was a thief, carrying stolen treasures and the seeds of her own destruction. 2 days later, Corinna sat in the back of an unmarked car in the shadowy district of Old Town, far from the gleaming towers and manicured gardens of the palace. The neighborhood was a maze of narrow streets and old buildings where people minded their own business and asked few questions. This was exactly what she needed for the meeting that would either save her or damn her completely. The dealer, Anton Reeves, had been recommended by someone she had met at one of the underground casinos. Anton specialized in high-end items that wealthy collectors wanted to acquire without the complications of public auctions or legal paperwork. He was discreet, professional, and most importantly, he never asked where items came from. His shop looked like any other antique store from the outside, but Corinna knew that the real business happened in the basement. She had spent hours rehearsing her story. These were pieces from her personal collection, family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. She was selling them to raise money for a private charity project. The story was believable enough, and Anton wouldn't care anyway as long as the pieces were genuine and valuable. The velvet pouch felt like it was burning against her skin where she had hidden it beneath her coat. She had chosen her simplest clothes and covered her distinctive red hair with a dark wig and sunglasses. Still, every person who walked past the car made her heart race with fear of recognition. Anton's shop was squeezed between a pawn shop and a coffee house that had seen better days. The windows were dusty, and the faded sign simply read, "Reeves Antiques." Corinna took a deep breath and walked inside. The bell above the door announcing her arrival with a soft chime. The shop was cramped and dim, filled with furniture, paintings, and objects from different eras. Crystal chandeliers hung next to medieval weapons, while Persian rugs covered floors littered with porcelain figures and silver serving pieces. The air smelled of old wood and dust. Mixed with something that might have been incense, Anton emerged from behind a tall bookshelf. He was a thin man in his 60s with sharp eyes and careful movements. His gray hair was perfectly combed, and his expensive suit seemed out of place in the cluttered shop. When he smiled, Corinna noticed that his teeth were too white and too perfect. "Mrs. Smith," he said, using the false name she had given when she called to arrange the meeting. "Right on time. Please come to my private office where we can discuss business properly." He led her through the maze of antiques to a door hidden behind a tapestry. The office beyond was completely different from the shop above. Everything was modern and clean, with proper lighting and security cameras in every corner. A large safe dominated one wall, while the desk was equipped with various tools for examining precious items. "Please have a seat," Anton said, gesturing to a leather chair. "I understand you have some family pieces you'd like to discuss." Corinna nodded and carefully removed the velvet pouch from beneath her coat. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing the stunning jewelry inside. Anton's eyes lit up immediately. Though he tried to hide his excitement behind a professional mask, he reached for a jeweler's loupe and began examining each piece with practiced precision. The midnight sapphire necklace made him whistle softly under his breath. The emerald earrings caused him to nod appreciatively. When he picked up the diamond bracelet, he spent several minutes studying it from every angle. "These are exceptional pieces," he said finally. "The craftsmanship is museum quality. May I ask about their provenance?" Corinna had prepared for this question. "They've been in my family for generations. My great-grandmother was, she moved in very wealthy circles in Europe before the war. These pieces came to America with her when she immigrated." Anton nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. In his business, he had heard countless stories about family treasures and European nobles fleeing various conflicts. The details mattered less than the quality of the items themselves. "I can see why your family treasured these," he continued. "The sapphires in this necklace are particularly remarkable. Burmese, if I'm not mistaken, and of the highest quality. The setting work is extraordinary." He spent the next hour examining each piece thoroughly, using various tools and techniques to verify their authenticity. Corinna sat in tense silence, fighting the urge to fidget or ask questions that might make her seem nervous. Finally, Anton set down his loupe and looked at her directly. "I can offer you 800,000 for the complete collection," he said. Cash, naturally, and the transaction would be completely confidential. The amount was less than she had hoped for, but more than enough to pay off Victor and have some left over. She tried not to look too eager as she considered the offer. "That seems reasonable," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "When could we complete the transaction?" "Today, if you'd like." "I have the funds available immediately." Anton's efficiency was both reassuring and terrifying. This was really happening. She was really going to sell Helena's precious jewelry to a stranger in a basement. As Anton prepared the money, Corinna tried to push away the images that kept flashing through her mind. Helena wearing the midnight sapphire necklace at state dinners, her eyes sparkling almost as brightly as the gems. The late queen showing her the diamond bracelet and explaining how it had been worn by 4 different queens over the centuries. The trust in Helena's voice when she spoke about the responsibility of caring for these precious symbols of royal heritage. "The money is ready," Anton announced, returning with a briefcase. 800,000, as agreed. He opened the case to show neat stacks of bills. It was more cash than Corinna had ever seen in one place, and the reality of what she was doing hit her like a physical blow. She was betraying everything Helena had taught her about honor and duty. She was stealing from the crown itself, from the people who trusted their royal family to preserve their heritage, but Victor's threat echoed in her mind, and she knew she had no choice. If her gambling debts became public, the scandal would destroy Marcus and damage the monarchy far more than the loss of a few pieces of jewelry. She was making a sacrifice to protect something larger than herself, she told herself, even as her heart broke. "Thank you," she managed to say as she took the briefcase. The money felt heavier than she had expected. "A pleasure doing business with you," Anton replied smoothly. "If you ever have other family pieces you'd like to discuss, please don't hesitate to contact me." Corinna left the shop as quickly as possible, her mind racing with plans for paying Victor and figuring out how to replace the missing jewelry before anyone noticed. She had no idea that Anton Reeves was already making phone calls to certain collectors who specialized in items with questionable backgrounds. Nor did she know that one of those collectors was a man who took particular pleasure in owning things that had been stolen from royalty. The money would solve her immediate problem. But Corinna was about to discover that some mistakes create problems that grow larger instead of disappearing. As she walked away from the antique shop, she felt like she was walking deeper into a trap that she had built around herself with her own poor choices. Captain Thomas Hardy had served as head of palace security for 15 years, and in all that time he had never faced a situation quite like this one. He stood in Helena's former study, staring at the open jewelry cases with a mixture of disbelief and growing dread. The missing pieces were some of the most valuable and historically significant items in the crown. jewel collection. The discovery had been made during the monthly security inventory, a routine check that Thomas personally supervised. Every piece of royal jewelry was catalogued and photographed, and the inventory was supposed to match perfectly with the official records. But when his assistant, Lieutenant Sarah Chun, began checking the cases in Helena's study, the discrepancies became immediately obvious. "Sir," Sarah had said, her voice tight with concern, "the midnight sapphire necklace isn't here. Neither are the Queen Margaret emerald earrings or the Victorian diamond bracelet." Thomas felt his stomach drop as he personally verified each missing item. These weren't pieces that could be misplaced or forgotten in someone's private quarters. They were major artifacts that had specific homes in the secure display cases. Someone had deliberately taken them, and that someone had known exactly how to bypass the security systems. The implications were staggering. Only a handful of people had access to this room and the codes needed to open the cases. King Marcus, of course, had complete access. So did Thomas himself and 2 other senior security officers. The palace curator, Dr. Elizabeth Wells, had access for maintenance and documentation purposes. And Queen Consort Corinna had been given the codes after Helena's death. As was traditional for the king's wife, Thomas immediately ordered the room sealed and began the delicate process of investigating each person with access. The senior security officers were above suspicion. They had been with the palace for decades and had passed countless background checks. Dr. Wells was similarly trustworthy. And besides, she would never steal items she had dedicated her career to protecting that left King Marcus and Queen Consort Corinna. The idea of investigating either of them made Thomas feel sick, but his duty was clear. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown and its treasures. Regardless of where the threat might come from, he began with a careful review of the security footage, though he knew it wouldn't show much. The cameras in Helena's study had been disabled during the Queen Consort's private visits, as was protocol for royal privacy. But the hallway cameras might show something useful. What he found made his blood run cold. The footage showed Queen Consort Corinna entering Helena's study alone 3 days earlier, staying for approximately 30 minutes, and leaving with what appeared to be a small bag or pouch that she hadn't been carrying when she arrived. The timestamp matched perfectly with when King Marcus had been away on a diplomatic mission. Thomas watched the footage several times, hoping he was misunderstanding what he was seeing. But there was no other explanation. The Queen Consort had taken something from the study, and now precious royal jewelry was missing. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. But accusing the Queen Consort of theft was not something Thomas could do lightly. The political implications were enormous, and if he was wrong, his career would be over instantly. He needed more evidence, and he needed to be absolutely certain before taking any action. He decided to investigate quietly, using only his most trusted officers. Lieutenant Chun had been with palace security for 8 years and had a spotless record. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez had served for 12 years and was known for his discretion. Together, they began looking into the Queen Consort's recent activities. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Credit checks revealed that Queen Consort Corinna had significant gambling debts at several establishments in the city. Security footage from these locations showed her placing increasingly large bets over the past 6 months. Financial records indicated that she had sold most of her personal jewelry and had borrowed money from multiple sources. The pattern was clear and heartbreaking. The Queen Consort had developed a serious gambling problem and was now in desperate financial trouble. The theft of Helena's jewelry wasn't random criminal behavior. It was the desperate act of someone who saw no other way out of an impossible situation. Thomas felt torn between his duty and his sympathy. He had known Corinna since she married King Marcus 5 years earlier. She had always seemed kind and genuine, if perhaps a bit overwhelmed by the responsibilities of royal life. The idea that she had fallen into such serious trouble was tragic, but it didn't change what needed to be done. The investigation took 2 weeks, during which Thomas barely slept. He and his team gathered evidence carefully and quietly, documenting every detail that supported their conclusion. They traced the Queen Consort's movements on the day of the theft, confirmed her debts with various creditors, and even discovered threatening letters that had been delivered to the palace. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. One of Thomas's contacts in the city's antique trade mentioned that someone matching the Queen Consort's description had been seen at Anton Reeves's shop, a place known for dealing in questionable merchandise. When Thomas discreetly showed his contact a photograph, the identification was positive. With heavy heart, Thomas realized he could no longer delay the inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming, and keeping the truth hidden any longer would make him complicit in the crime. He arranged a private meeting with King Marcus. Knowing that this conversation would change everything for the royal family, the king received him in his private office, a room Thomas had visited countless times over the years. Usually their meetings were routine briefings about security matters or upcoming events. Today, Thomas carried a folder that would shatter King Marcus's world. "Your Majesty," Thomas began, his voice carefully controlled, "I'm afraid I have some very serious news regarding the crown jewel collection." King Marcus looked up from the diplomatic papers he had been reviewing. "What kind of news, Thomas? Has there been a security breach?" "Yes, sir. Several valuable pieces are missing from Queen Helena's former study. The midnight sapphire necklace, the Queen Margaret emerald earrings, the Victorian diamond bracelet, and 2 other pieces." The color drained from King Marcus's face. "Missing? How is that possible? Who had access?" Thomas took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been dreading. "Sir, based on our investigation, we have strong evidence that the items were taken by Queen Consort Corinna." The silence that followed was deafening. King Marcus stared at Thomas as if he had spoken in a foreign language. Then, slowly, the king's expression changed from confusion to disbelief to something that looked like physical pain. "That's impossible," King Marcus said finally. "Corinna would never. There must be some mistake." Thomas opened the folder and began laying out the evidence piece by piece. The security footage, the financial records, the witness identification from the antique dealer. Each document fell like a blow, and Thomas watched as King Marcus's faith in his wife crumbled before his eyes. When Thomas finished his presentation, King Marcus sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Finally, he looked up with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the span of an hour. "What do you recommend we do?" The king asked quietly. "Sir, that decision is above my authority level. But the theft of crown jewels is a serious crime, regardless of who commits it. The items need to be recovered, and the person responsible needs to face consequences." King Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the impossible position he was now in. His wife had betrayed not just him personally, but the crown itself. The scandal would rock the monarchy, but the alternative, covering up the crime, would be even worse if it ever came to light. "Give me 24 hours, King Marcus said. "I need to speak with Corinna before we take any official action." Thomas bowed respectfully. "Of course, Your Majesty. But, sir, I should mention that we believe some of the stolen items may have already been sold. Time may be crucial for recovery." As Thomas left the king's office, he felt the weight of what was about to unfold. The royal family was about to tear itself apart, and he had been the one forced to light the fuse. The confrontation came on a gray Thursday morning when the palace felt particularly cold and empty. King Marcus had spent the entire night walking through the gardens, trying to find the right words for a conversation he never thought he would need to have. When he finally returned to the royal quarters, he found Corinna in their private sitting room, reading a book and sipping tea as if nothing in the world was wrong. She looked up when he entered, and her smile faltered when she saw his expression. Marcus had always been easy to read, and right now his face showed a mixture of pain, anger, and something that looked like grief for the living. "Marcus?" she said, setting down her teacup with careful precision. "You look terrible. Did something happen on your trip?" He sat across from her in the chair he had occupied thousands of times during their marriage, but today the familiar space felt like foreign territory. Between them lay the evidence folder that Captain Hardy had prepared, though Marcus hoped he wouldn't need to open it. "Corinna," he began, his voice strangely formal, "I need to ask you about something very serious. Some items are missing from my mother's jewelry collection. The color drained from Corinna's face so quickly that Marcus felt his heart break and his worst fears confirm themselves simultaneously. She tried to maintain her composure, but her hands began to shake, and she gripped the arms of her chair as if trying to anchor herself. "Missing?" she managed to say. "What do you mean, missing?" "The midnight sapphire necklace, among others. Captain Hardy discovered the theft during a routine security check." Marcus watched his wife's face carefully, looking for any sign that might contradict the evidence. "Corinna, only a few people have access to that room. Only a few people know the security codes." Corinna's breathing became shallow and rapid. She opened her mouth several times as if to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she whispered, "Marcus, I can explain." The admission hit him like a physical blow. Part of him had still hoped that Hardy was wrong, that there was some other explanation for the missing jewelry and the security footage. But Corinna's words made denial impossible. "Explain what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer was going to destroy what remained of his world. Corinna stood abruptly and began pacing the room, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. "I was going to tell you," she said rapidly. "I was going to find a way to replace everything before anyone noticed. I never meant for it to go this far." "Go this far?" Marcus repeated. "Corinna, what are you talking about?" The whole story came pouring out of her in a desperate rush. The gambling that had started as harmless entertainment, the debts that had grown beyond her control, the threats from creditors, the impossible choice between her reputation and the crown's treasures. She told him about the sleepless nights, the fear that consumed her daily life, and the terrible moment when she realized she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Marcus listened in stunned silence as his wife described a secret life he had never suspected. While he had been focused on diplomatic missions and state affairs, she had been spiraling into a crisis that had ultimately led her to steal from his own family's heritage. $800,000, he said when she finished her confession. "You sold my mother's jewelry for $800,000 to pay gambling debts." Corinna stopped pacing and looked at him with tears streaming down her face. "Marcus, please try to understand." "I was trapped. Viktor Kozlov said he would expose everything if I didn't pay him back. The scandal would have destroyed you, destroyed the monarchy itself. So instead you decided to steal from the crown?" Marcus's voice was rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "You decided to sell artifacts that have been in my family for centuries to pay off your gambling debts? I was going to find a way to replace them." Corinna protested. "I was going to get them back somehow. I thought if I could just buy some time." Marcus stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens where his mother used to walk every morning. Those gardens had been witness to centuries of royal drama, but he doubted they had ever seen anything quite like this. "The midnight sapphire necklace was made for Queen Isabella in 1743, he said quietly. "My mother wore it to every important state function for 47 years. It's not just jewelry, Corinna. It's history. It's irreplaceable." "I know," she whispered. "I know what I've done is unforgivable." Marcus turned back to face his wife, and she saw something in his expression that terrified her more than any of Victor's threats ever had. It was the look of a man whose trust had been completely shattered. "Captain Hardy has evidence," Marcus said. "Security footage, financial records, witness statements. This isn't something we can hide or explain away." Corinna felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. "What does that mean?" "It means that the theft of crown jewels is a serious crime, regardless of who commits it. It means that the Palace Legal Council is already preparing options for how to handle this situation." The full implications of her actions were finally becoming clear to Corinna. This wasn't just about their marriage or their personal relationship. She had committed a crime against the state itself, and the consequences would be public and devastating. "Marcus, please," she begged, dropping to her knees beside his chair. "Please don't let them arrest me. I'll do anything to make this right. I'll pay back every penny. I'll get the jewelry back somehow." Marcus looked down at his wife, and for a moment his resolve wavered. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, The woman he had chosen to stand beside him as he faced the challenges of ruling a modern monarchy. But she was also someone he apparently had never really known. How? He asked. How will you pay back $800,000? How will you recover jewelry that's probably already been sold to private collectors? How will you undo the damage to the crown's reputation when this becomes public? Corinna had no answers because there weren't any good ones. She had acted without thinking about consequences, driven by desperation and the gambler's eternal belief that everything would somehow work out if she could just buy a little more time. The silence stretched between them until Marcus finally spoke again. Captain Hardy is recommending that we involve the police immediately. He says that trying to handle this privately would only make things worse when the truth eventually comes out. The police? Corinna's voice was barely audible. And the media will find out, Marcus continued relentlessly. They always do. The story of a queen consort caught stealing the crown jewels will be international news within hours. Corinna realized that her desperate attempt to protect Marcus and the monarchy from scandal had actually guaranteed a much worse scandal. Instead of gambling debts that could have been paid privately, there would now be criminal charges, police investigations, and a media circus that would dominate headlines for months. I've destroyed everything, she said. Finally understanding the full scope of what her actions had set in motion, Marcus stood and walked toward the door. I need time to think about this. The palace legal team wants to meet with both of us this afternoon to discuss our options. Our options? Corinna looked up at him with desperate hope. The monarchy's options? Marcus corrected gently. Your choices ended when you opened those jewelry cases? As he reached the door, he paused without turning around. I loved you, Corinna. I trusted you with everything I am and everything I represent. That trust was apparently misplaced. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Corinna alone with the full weight of her choices and the growing certainty that her life as she had known it was over. The palace conference room had hosted discussions about war declarations, peace treaties, and constitutional crises, but the emergency meeting called for that afternoon felt more tense than any of those historic moments. King Marcus sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by his most trusted advisors. Queen Consort Corinna sat at the opposite end, looking small and isolated despite the grand surroundings. The attendees represented the core of the royal establishment. Lord Chancellor Robert Ashford, the king's chief legal advisor, had served the crown for 3 decades and had never faced a scandal of this magnitude. Prime Minister Elizabeth Morrison had been hastily briefed on the situation and understood immediately how devastating this could be for the government's stability. Sir James Wellington, the palace's communications director, was already developing damage control strategies for what seemed inevitable public disclosure. Captain Thomas Hardy sat with his evidence folder, ready to present the facts that no one in the room wanted to hear. The atmosphere was so tense that everyone seemed afraid to breathe too loudly. Lord Chancellor Ashford began the meeting with characteristic directness. Your Majesty, we are here to discuss an unprecedented situation. Queen Consort Corinna has admitted to stealing crown jewels valued at approximately £3 million from Queen Helena's collection. Even though everyone in the room already knew the basic facts, hearing them stated so bluntly made the reality even more stark. Prime Minister Morrison shifted uncomfortably in her seat, already calculating how this scandal would affect her party's standing in upcoming elections. The items taken include the midnight sapphire necklace, the Queen Margaret emerald earrings, the Victorian diamond bracelet, and 2 other significant pieces, Ashford continued. These artifacts have been sold to a dealer named Anton Reeves, who has already transferred them to private collectors. Sir James Wellington leaned forward. Have we made any contact with this dealer? Is there any possibility of recovering the items quietly? Captain Hardy shook his head grimly. We've investigated Mr. Reeves's operation thoroughly. He specializes in providing valuable items to collectors who prefer anonymity and who ask no questions about provenance. Once items enter his network, they typically disappear into private collections worldwide. King Marcus had been staring at his hands throughout the discussion, but now he looked up. What are our legal obligations in this matter? Lord Chancellor Ashford consulted his notes. Your Majesty, the theft of Crown property is a serious criminal offence under British law. Normally, we would be required to report this to the Metropolitan Police immediately. However, given the unique circumstances involving a member of the royal family, we have some discretion in how to proceed. What discretion? Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be encouraging. We could handle this as an internal matter initially, but only if we believe the items can be recovered quickly and quietly. Given Mr. Reeves's reputation and the time that has already passed, that seems unlikely. If we delay reporting to authorities and the theft becomes public through other means, it will appear that the Crown attempted to cover up criminal activity. Prime Minister Morrison spoke for the first time. Your Majesty, I must advise you that any appearance of a cover-up would be politically devastating. The opposition parties would use this as evidence that the royal family considers itself above the law. Corinna finally found her voice. What if I cooperate fully with recovering the jewelry? What if I provide all the information about where it was sold and help track down the buyers? Lord Chancellor Ashford looked at her with something approaching pity. Your Majesty, while cooperation would be helpful, it doesn't change the fundamental legal situation. A crime has been committed, and there are procedures that must be followed. Sir James Wellington had been scribbling notes frantically. How long do we have before this becomes public knowledge? Are there any leaks we need to worry about? Captain Hardy answered immediately. The investigation has been limited to 3 trusted officers, and Dr. Wells, the palace curator, was told only that there had been a security issue. However, Mr. Reeves knows about the sale, and his business associates may have recognized the significance of the items. Word could leak at any time. The weight of inevitability settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Everyone understood that they weren't really discussing whether to involve the police, but rather how to manage the catastrophe when they did. King Marcus stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace courtyard. What happens to Corinna if we proceed with criminal charges? The penalties for theft of this magnitude could include several years in prison, Ashford replied carefully. However, given her cooperation and status, it's possible that a plea agreement could result in lighter sentencing, possibly including house arrest or community service. And what happens to the monarchy? Marcus asked the question that everyone had been avoiding. Prime Minister Morrison exchanged glances with Sir James before answering. Your Majesty, there will undoubtedly be calls for your abdication. The opposition will argue that the royal family cannot be trusted to protect the nation's heritage. There will be demands for investigations into palace security and financial oversight. Public opinion will be crucial, Sir James added. How we handle the announcement and the Queen Consort's response will determine whether this is seen as a personal failing or a systemic problem with the monarchy itself. Corinna spoke quietly from her end of the table. I'll accept whatever consequences come from this. I'll make a full confession and take complete responsibility. But please don't let my mistakes destroy the crown that Marcus has served so faithfully. Lord Chancellor Ashford cleared his throat. There is one option we haven't discussed yet, though it's unprecedented in modern times. Everyone turned to look at him expectantly. Banishment, he said simply. The sovereign has the traditional authority to banish subjects from the realm. If Queen Consort Corinna were to be stripped of her titles and permanently exiled, it would demonstrate that the crown takes this matter seriously while avoiding the political complications of criminal prosecution. The suggestion hung in the air like an explosive device. Banishment seemed like something from medieval times, not a solution for a modern constitutional monarchy. Is that even legally possible today? Prime Minister Morrison asked. The power exists, though it hasn't been used in living memory, Ashford confirmed. It would require careful legal structuring to ensure it complies with human rights laws, but it could be done. King Marcus turned back to the room, his face showing the strain of impossible choices. And the jewelry? Would banishment help recover the stolen items? Possibly, Captain Hardy said. If we can present the dealers and collectors with evidence of a formal royal response, including banishment, they might be more willing to return the items rather than face international legal pressure. Corinna realized that banishment might actually be the least destructive option for everyone involved. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady for the first time all day, "if exile would protect the crown and possibly help recover the jewelry, then that's what should happen." The king looked at his wife across the expanse of the conference table, seeing both the woman he had loved and the criminal she had become. "Corinna, do you understand what banishment would mean? You would be stripped of all royal titles and privileges. You could never return to Britain. You would have to build a completely new life somewhere else." "I understand," she replied. "It's better than destroying everything you've worked for." Lord Chancellor Ashford was already making notes. "If we proceed with banishment, it would need to be announced immediately, along with a full explanation of the circumstances. The ceremony would be formal and public, demonstrating that the Crown does not tolerate criminal behavior from anyone, regardless of status." Sir James Wellington nodded grimly. "The media response will still be intense, but the narrative would focus on swift royal justice rather than cover-up attempts." As the meeting concluded with plans for implementing the most dramatic royal punishment in centuries, everyone understood that they were witnessing the end of more than just Corinna's marriage and status. They were documenting the moment when the modern monarchy proved it was willing to sacrifice everything to maintain its integrity, even if that sacrifice included destroying one of its own members. The ancient ceremony of royal banishment had not been performed in over 200 years, but the palace staff worked through the night to prepare for a ritual that would forever change the British monarchy's modern history. The throne room, which had witnessed coronations, state visits, and countless moments of royal triumph, would now host the most humiliating punishment the crown could inflict. Corinna spent her final night in the palace alone in the guest quarters where she had been moved after confessing her crimes. Her personal belongings had been packed into 3 small suitcases, a pathetic collection representing 5 years as queen consort. The jewelry, gowns, and ceremonial items that had defined her royal life would remain behind, as they belonged to the crown rather than to her personally. Sleep was impossible. She stood at the window looking out at the gardens where she had walked with Marcus during happier times, trying to memorize details she would never see again. The rose garden where they had held their engagement announcement, the fountain where they had shared quiet conversations about their hopes for the future, the maze where they had hidden from palace staff when they wanted to steal a few moments of privacy. All of those memories now felt like they belonged to someone else. A different woman who had believed she could handle the pressures of royal life. That woman had been naive and unprepared, but she had been innocent. The woman who would face banishment in the morning was a criminal who had betrayed everything she had sworn to protect at dawn. Lady Margaret Thornton, the senior lady-in-waiting, arrived to help Corinna prepare for the ceremony. Margaret had served the royal family for 30 years and had assisted with countless important events. But her face showed how difficult she found this particular duty. "Your Majesty," Margaret began, then stopped herself. "Forgive me, Corinna, we need to discuss what happens today." The correction of her title was like a small knife wound. After today, no one would ever call her Your Majesty again. "The ceremony will be broadcast live across the Commonwealth," Margaret explained. "King Marcus will read the formal charges and pronounce the banishment. You'll be required to surrender your wedding ring, your coronet, and any other symbols of royal status." Corinna nodded silently. She had already removed her wedding ring and placed it on the dresser, unable to bear wearing it any longer. The simple gold band seemed to mock her with memories of the promises she had broken. "Where will I go?" Corinna asked. "A private jet will take you to Switzerland initially. You have distant relatives there who have agreed to provide temporary accommodation, while you establish permanent residency elsewhere. The Swiss authorities have been briefed and will ensure your safety during the transition." The practical arrangements felt surreal. In a matter of hours, she would go from being one of the most protected people in the world to being essentially stateless. Dependent on the kindness of relatives she barely knew. At 10 o'clock, the throne room filled with members of parliament, foreign ambassadors, senior clergy, and representatives from across the Commonwealth. The media was present in unprecedented numbers. Broadcasting lived to an estimated global audience of 500 million people. King Marcus entered wearing the full ceremonial robes of state, the imperial state crown gleaming under the television lights. He looked older than his 43 years, and the weight of what he was about to do showed clearly on his face. Behind him walked the Lord Chancellor carrying the official documents, followed by Captain Hardy with the evidence of Corinna's crimes. When Corinna was escorted into the throne room, a collective gasp went up from the assembled crowd. She wore a simple black dress with no jewelry or royal insignia, looking more like a defendant in a criminal court than a member of the royal family. Her head was held high, but everyone could see that she was trembling. The ceremony began with the Lord Chancellor reading the formal charges in a voice that echoed through the vast room. Corinna Elizabeth Margaret, formerly Queen Consort of the United Kingdom and the other Commonwealth realms, you stand accused of theft of crown property, specifically the unlawful taking of royal jewelry valued at approximately £3 million. The words seemed to hang in the air, making the impossible situation feel devastatingly real. Cameras captured every detail, from Corinna's pale face to the shocked expressions of foreign diplomats who had never witnessed anything like this. King Marcus stood and began reading from the banishment proclamation, his voice steady despite the personal cost of every word. By the authority vested in me as your sovereign, and in consideration of your admitted crimes against the crown, I hereby strip you of all royal titles, privileges, and protections. He paused, and for a moment the mask of royal ceremony slipped, revealing the personal agony underneath. Then he continued with renewed determination. You are hereby banished from the United Kingdom and all Commonwealth realms, never to return under penalty of immediate arrest and prosecution. Your marriage to the crown is dissolved, and you are no longer recognized as a member of the royal family. Corinna stepped forward and placed her coronet on the table beside the throne, followed by the ceremonial medals and orders she had been awarded during her time as queen consort. The simple act of removing these symbols felt like watching herself disappear piece by piece. The most difficult moment came when she had to surrender the medallion that Helena had given her on her wedding day, a family heirloom that represented her acceptance into the royal lineage. Placing it on the table felt like betraying Helena's memory one final time. King Marcus concluded the ceremony with words that would be remembered for centuries. Let this serve as proof that the crown recognizes no privilege above the law, and that betrayal of the people's trust carries the severest possible consequences. Justice has been served. As Corinna was escorted from the throne room for the last time, she caught sight of herself in one of the ornate mirrors that lined the walls. The reflection showed a stranger, a woman whose face bore the marks of disgrace and whose future held nothing but uncertainty and exile. The final irony came as she was driven away from the palace in an unmarked car. News reports were already confirming that 3 of the 5 stolen jewelry pieces had been recovered after collectors voluntarily returned them upon learning of their criminal origins. The swift and severe royal response had indeed encouraged cooperation from the art world, but the 4th and 5th pieces, including Helena's precious midnight sapphire necklace, remained missing. Some crimes, Corinna realized as London disappeared behind her, create wounds that never fully heal. The necklace that Helena had worn with such pride would probably never again grace a royal ceremony, and the trust that had been broken might take generations to rebuild. As the plane lifted off from British soil, carrying her toward an uncertain future in exile, Corinna understood that she had become a cautionary tale that would be told for centuries. The queen consort who destroyed herself and nearly destroyed the monarchy for the fleeting hope of solving problems that gambling had created. The crown would survive her, disgrace, and probably grow stronger for having proven its commitment to justice. But Corinna would spend the rest of her life carrying the weight of choices that had transformed her. from Queen Consort to the most infamous exile in modern royal history.